is recall election day in California, and voters in the state have hours left to decide if Governor Gavin Newsom gets to keep his job. 46 candidates are vying to replace him. That will only happen, though, should the recall win more than 50% of votes. It is the first time in nearly 2 decades that a state's top position has been on the line. Proponents of the recall have several grievances against Governor Newsom, including his response to the pandemic and rising food and gas prices. The state leader wrapped up his campaign with a final push from the most prominent Democrat in the nation. Of course, that is President Biden. At a rally in Long Beach last night, the president stressed the importance of the race.
The eyes of the nation, this is not hyperbole, the eyes of the nation are on California. Because the decision you're about to make isn't just going to have a huge impact on California. It's going to reverberate around the nation, and quite frankly, not a joke, around the world.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in Major Garrett. He's in Los Angeles. Major, yesterday, President Biden said many of the issues that define the 2020 presidential race have been resurrected in California. Explain what the president was referencing there.
Well, what's happened in California with this recall effort, it was driven by Republicans who have been the not only minority party in California, but distinct minority party in California for the better part of 15 years. It wasn't at the onset of this recall effort a distinctly Trumpian influenced effort, but it's become so with the rise of Larry Elder, who is now the leading Republican candidate. If in fact, Gavin Newsom is recalled and he's the top vote getter, he would be California's next governor. And he's very much like Donald Trump. He doesn't believe in the minimum wage. He doesn't call himself a climate change denier, but he calls himself a climate change alarmism denier. He also is very distinctly and staunchly pro-life, and essentially brought a Trumpian sound to California Republican politics. That has frustrated many California Republicans we've talked to in the last 3 days, who basically wanted a conversation in California about Governor Newsom's record as governor, which they said has a lot of weaknesses to it, not just with coronavirus, but rising homelessness, criminal justice. Their estimation is that crime has gone up in California and that Governor Newsom has done a poor job on that. A lot of issues they wanted to talk about. Well, now in the last 5 weeks or so here in California, this has all been about Larry Elder and Trumpian Republican politics and the big lie, because Larry Elder has said he's not sure he's going to accept the results of this election. It may have fraud embedded in it. All of those things have sort of come to the fore. And so Joe Biden said last night, as President of the United States, California matters because the progressive agenda he has embraced and that started long before he became president here in California is essentially up for grabs. And because that progressive agenda has been prevailing here in California for such a good long while, and Democrats are now energized in this race in ways they weren't 8 or 9 weeks ago, Democrats feel pretty confident that Governor Newsom is going to prevail and defeat this recall.
Yeah, and the president jumped, all over that Trump-Elder kind of comparison, calling him a clone of Donald Trump. But then you just pointed out something else, too. He also is sort of used this as an opportunity to sort of push his legislative agenda. I mean, he's showing up kind of the day before the final day of voting. A lot of people have already voted, so it's sort of, debatable what sort of influence the president would have on this recall election. But certainly it was a great opportunity for him to talk about some of the stuff that he's been working on in Washington. That's right. And look, Democrats in California know that Governor Newsom, according to the polls, was in real jeopardy 5 weeks ago. This was a 4 or 5, some polls had it a 3-point race on recall. That shows that in California, Governor Newsom is not altogether that overwhelmingly popular. What's happened that's changed this race has made Governor Newsom not any more popular, but Larry Elder more frightening to Californians. And that's what's energized Democrats. Last night, top Newsom advisors told us the California base has been woken up. And it's gotten into this game. And because California Democrats have voted so aggressively, he's now in much safer position than he was 4 or 5 weeks ago. Not because he's loved here in California, but because Larry Elder became a specter of sort of Trump politics that frightened Californians and got the Democratic base motivated. So why does President Biden care about all of this? Well, he knew that if Gavin Newsom were defeated here in California, or there was even a tighter, close race, that would undercut any sense of Democratic momentum going into the midterm election. And trust me, the Biden White House needs all the Democratic unity and momentum it can muster right now,
because a lot of tough decisions are going to have to be made by House and Senate Democrats in Washington about the Biden agenda. He needs a victory in California to propel Democrats into the midterm race and the Virginia governor's race coming up in November. So this was a time not to lose any momentum, but to gain it. And that's why Joe Biden came ahead here kind of at the last moment, thinking that Governor Newsom is going to win, possibly could win handily, and then he could bask in some of that, bring some of that momentum and Democratic unity back to Washington. At least that is the hope of the Biden White House.
So, Major, you alluded to this. The recall effort began to gain momentum after the governor's COVID-19 restrictions angered Republicans across the state. What are some of the other issues that are top of mind for voters?
Well, you mentioned inflation. That's a big thing. The cost of living in California is a persistent issue. It is very difficult to rent an apartment in California at an affordable price or to buy a home. And many middle class and lower middle class Californians are finding that struggle to be greater and greater as each and every year goes by. Related to that is a very large homelessness problem in San Francisco and Los Angeles, a little bit less so in my hometown of San Diego, but still visible and problematic there. Also, during the COVID-19 lockdowns, many prisoners in the California penitentiary system were released. And we have talked to some voters here who believe those released prisoners had more rights under Gavin Newsom's approach to COVID than did small businesses or churchgoers here in California. All of those have created friction points, many of which California Republicans wanted to recall the governor for long before COVID-19. But the pandemic and the restrictions made things more aggravating for those California Republicans. Some things that Governor Newsom did in his own personal life, the French Laundry dinner. I don't have to go into all the details about that, but essentially he went to a very fancy restaurant, did so without a mask, with lobbyists, no social distancing, right when he was asking every Californian, if not ordering them, to do exactly those things, stay at home, wear masks, social distance. That contrast really engaged the recall effort. They were able to collect enough signatures and make this race at least one point this summer closer than it is now. But as I mentioned before, it's not Gavin Newsom, this super popular, beloved governor of California, who's going to prevail tonight if in fact he does, or tomorrow. It will be Gavin Newsom, a governor who is on balance, more popular than not, with issues like COVID-19, generally speaking, more popular than not, and the specter of Trumpian Republican politics in California, much more, that will save him if in fact he prevails in this recall.
So speaking of that, Major, you had a really good interview with Larry Elder, and he kind of seemed to back away from some of the more controversial things that he had said that sounded very Trumpy. But there is one area that I don't know if he's completely backing away from, and that's the idea that there may be fraud in this election. Every active registered voter in California was mailed a ballot. If you go on Larry Elder's campaign website, there's a link at the top, encouraging people to report any sort of fraud that they may have noticed in elections, but also kind of weaved in there is this election. I'm wondering if there's a possibility that the outcome of this election could be challenged, if this is resonating with Republicans in California, this idea that there are still issues with fraud, possibly.
We talked to a lot of Republicans who support the recall, don't like Gavin Newsom. All of them told us they have concerns about this election and previous elections. They're not really sure what those concerns are. They just think that there's something amiss. They don't have a real sense of what it is that is amiss, but their concerns are real and they believe them. What's true in California is this election is being conducted exactly the way the 2020 election was conducted. What happened in the 2020 election? We asked Joe Biden carried California, no kidding. Did so handily. But another couple of things happened that did not work out so well for California Democrats. There were 4 ballot initiatives placed on the California ballot by progressives. All 4 of them went down to not just defeat, but pretty sizable defeat. Now, if that election were rigged, the progressives would have not lost those initiatives, but they did. And what else happened in that election? Republicans won back several House seats, meaning U.S. House of Representatives seats, that they lost in the 2018 midterms. All right, so if that election were fraudulent, why would those progressive initiatives have gone down to defeat? And how would Republicans have won those House seats. It makes no sense. It is absurd on its face. And that's not my orientation to this underlying question. That's the orientation of John Cox, who's running against Larry Elder, Republican. He ran against Gavin Newsom in 2018. The two-term mayor of San Diego, Kevin Faulconer, and other Republicans. Like, election fraud is not a part of this conversation. There's nothing about this election that is out of kilter. It's only Larry Elder and the Trumpian Republicans who refuse to give up on this idea that there is something wrong with the system when in fact the system works just fine.
Yeah, and so, Major, the question becomes, of course, is that going to be the norm going forward? You, others, have tried to ask Larry Elder if he will accept the results of the election tonight, whatever they may be. He refuses to say so on the record. Are we entering a period now in American politics where there will be members of certain parties who, if they lose, will question the results of that election, of that loss? And why it matters, of course, is not because of what the politician is saying. It's because of what people who perhaps don't have access to all different sources of news, perhaps they rely on only one source of news, may be led to believe, which, you know, we saw what that could do in the national election on January 6th. I mean, are we going to see a repeat of those instances going forward? An erosion of democracy, essentially.
When we talked about this very topic with Governor Newsom's top advisors last night, they said, look, in California and quite possibly in the rest of the country, there are not two parties anymore. There's not a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. These are their words, not mine. There's a Democratic Party and an anti-Democratic Party. And they say those here in California who embrace the Larry Elder sense of questions about this election with no basis in reality whatsoever, meaning no evidence to point to of anything going wrong, are anti-democratic, and they're undermining the very system that they seek to participate in. Now, one thing that happens in politics, you keep trying a message until you keep losing with it. And we're going to find out in the midterm elections coming up how effective or not effective this particular message is. It might be effective in a series of Republican primaries, but can you win a general election that way? John Cox told us no, Republicans can't in California. It's a completely dead-end issue, his words. Kevin Faulconer said it's outrageous for Larry Elder to raise issues about this election when there's no basis for that in reality. It's a complete time waster, and it's not a winning strategy. You've got to get people to vote for you, and for them to vote for you, they have to have confidence in the system. And by suggesting the system is broke before it's even had a chance to be tested, undermines that confidence. So it's not as if this is a one-sided Republican debate in California where only Larry Elder is speaking about this and everyone else agrees with him. That's not true. Plenty of other California Republicans don't believe there's anything wrong with this election. And as I mentioned a moment ago, they point to 2020 and they say everything was fine and everything's going to be fine this time. And if Larry Elder doesn't win, it's because Californians don't want him to be the next governor. So that's sort of where we find ourselves. This issue persists. Trumpian-influenced Republicans believe it. They want their candidates to talk about it. But if they keep losing, not in Republican primaries, but in general election contests, this message will actually reckon with the actual political process it is trying to undermine. And we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, indeed. Major Garrett, thank you.